morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. We are still homeless, unfortunately. They can take our studio, they can take our setup, but they can't take our desire to comment on the news, I guess. So
and the lighting.
Right, exactly.
They cannot take the lighting. I would like whoever made these lights, I'd like them just to follow me around life. People are like, oh, you look so different on TV than you do in real life. I'm like, yeah, I would love to just walk around with great lighting. Everyone deserves great lighting in life.
I think we're making it work. So let's get to our top news story. Take it away, Naomi.
Former President Trump held a very strange rally, even for his standards. Trump was in suburban Philadelphia last night, where he rambled about Hannibal Lecter and told the crowd to vote on January 5th. The rally was then derailed by multiple medical interruptions from members in the crowd. And so Trump decided it'd be best to end the rally with 30 minutes of his campaign playlist while he stood on stage and swayed. Take a look.
Well, sir, do you want to play your song and then greet a few people, or do you want to? Well, you had said you wanted to close with a specific song.
Sì, lo so che non c'è luce in una stanza quando manca il sole. Se non ci sei tu con me, sulle finestre mostra tutto il mio cuore che è acceso, chiudi dentro me.
I actually don't know what that song is, but I think it's beautiful. Conservative influencer Greg Price reacted to Kamala headquarters mocking of Trump's rally, writing, quote, Kamala HQ is now mocking President Trump because he stopped his town hall when two people in the crowd had medical emergencies and listened to music with his supporters for the last 30 minutes. A new low for a truly pathetic campaign.
Still others online insist Trump is not cognitively well. Activist Amy Siskin wrote, Trump abruptly ended his town hall at Greater Philadelphia Expo Center just now after taking just 5 questions. He stood on the stage looking confused and lost. This man is not cognitively well. But Trump continues to insist it's not Kamala who's not cognitively well. Trump wrote, quote, I believe it is very important that Kamala Harris pass a test on cognitive stamina and agility. Her actions have led many to believe that there could be something very wrong with her.
In other Harris news, the VP has unveiled new proposals targeting black men. Her proposals include giving $1 million in forgivable loans of up to $20,000 to black entrepreneurs, legalizing recreational marijuana, and also protecting cryptocurrency assets. President Obama was quick to throw his support behind her plan, writing on X, quote, Kamala Harris has a plan that will lift up black men and their families. She's laid out some ways to give black men the tools to build wealth, achieve financial freedom, and lower costs. Meanwhile, in a surprising move, Harris has agreed to a live-to-tape, sit-down interview with Fox News anchor Bret Baier that will air tomorrow. Very interesting.
It's time to say goodbye. That's the song, Robby. So, it's a beautiful
maybe
song.
It's time to say hello. I don't know. Look, what was the problem with the rally? He didn't look cognitively impaired. This is lunacy to me. There was a medical emergency that people had in the crowd, so they played some music and ended it early. That's a fine and responsible thing to do. Furthermore, the cognitive decline argument coming from Democratic and progressive activists is in such bad faith, given that the person it most obviously applies to is Joe Biden, the sitting president, who is invisible right now because we can't let the public see the state he's in all likelihood. We worry, unable to make decisions at a time where the nation is in crisis, the world is in crisis, foreign policy is going all out of whack. We could have World War III in the Middle East. What is Biden doing to prevent it? I have no idea. Every time we see him, we are deeply concerned that he can't do the job. I am deeply concerned, and I'm not the only one, that he can't be president right now. And yet it's Donald Trump who's cognitively impaired. Now, to be fair, I don't think the cognitive arguments against Kamala Harris are very compelling. I disagree with Kamala Harris. I don't agree with or even really understand what her policies are, but it's not a cognitive impairment issue. To be clear, I don't think that argument is very fair against her, but it's not fair against him either.
KamalaHarris.com. Go check out her policies. She has 250 pages worth of economic policies.
Okay, I'll read through a website.
That's important. You want to know. Listen to her interviews. She did a town hall for Univision. She's done several interviews this week. She has one coming up with Bret Baier. You're arguing over Joe Biden's cognitive abilities. I think the Democratic Party fully argued that. That was why he stepped aside. Yeah. And he's given multiple press conferences this week. He actually
when they had no choice but to admit it.
He also gave multiple press conferences this week, especially in light of the hurricanes that hit the East Coast and southern East Coast. And on top of it, he canceled a foreign policy trip for those hurricanes to deal with like real people's problems in terms of countering FEMA disinformation. You can watch him if you want. It's out there. I know you don't want to. I know Republicans and conservatives love to say he's not doing anything. It's also what is convenient to them. Just like Donald Trump can say whatever he wants, and his folks, his most rabid supporters will say, yeah, Kamala Harris has a cognitive issue. It's not Donald Trump who's now wearing a new shade of, I don't know what that paste was on his face. It's, you know, how could any sane person go out running for president and put a new shade of orange paste on his face? It's dripping down his face. Come on.
Who cares?
Well, I care. I mean, yesterday he decided.
We care about what his makeup situation is.
Well, I think there's a lot of indications that he is not cognitively well. Maybe it wasn't the music. I agree with you there. I think that there's a lot of stuff that happens. You know, that when you pull the shot out. There's more context, just as the GOP likes to highlight photos of, you know, Joe Biden waving, and turns out there's somebody on the other side of the photo if you zoom out. I get it. That we all do it. It's media. Like, we're always looking for something. But Donald Trump threatened to have the military go after his political opponents on the left. That's very scary. That's the next level of authoritarian handbook. I don't know what comes after that. I mean, he's not in office. Well, I do know what comes after that. He's going to contest the election. I mean, he's going to tell his voters to vote on January 5th, which is very bizarre. I don't know what that means. I hope they listen. I hope.
Whoa! That making that observation, which you just said on on Twitter, can get. Speaking of authoritarianism, will get you a visit from the FBI. It will get you prosecuted.
I was kidding.
But people are even jokes.
I hope they listen to Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, I get that you were kidding. I don't think it's a big deal. I think it's fine to tell jokes. I think that the FBI doesn't. The Biden DOJ doesn't.
So they're going to go to Donald Trump for spreading a falsehood about.
Well, no, but you're talking about authoritarianism. I think it's authoritarianism to shut down satire and free speech on social media. Something every agency of the federal government attempted under the incumbent administration. But so there's a lot of authoritarianism to go around.
Okay, that's different. We're talking about a presidential candidate wanting a real coup, because last time his people that staged the Capitol got arrested, some died actually, as well as the authorities that were trying to prevent.
There was a riot. There was a spontaneous riot at the Capitol. It was very bad. I was there. I covered it. I was reported on it. I watched it happen. It was very bad. The people who broke some windows and trespassed and roughed up cops all got systematically arrested, thrown in prison, prosecuted,
100%.
Which is fine. It was not a coup. There was no danger of the government being overthrown in this kind of action. It was a riot at a public building that was very bad and has been prosecuted as it should be. And we're not going to have that happen again, because there will be additional security measures. I've seen them. They're very irritating. It's harder to get around the Capitol.
But he's asking for the military to intervene and go after his political opponents. He's asking for the military
to intervene in the problems he sees in America. Now, you can disagree with that.
What are the problems? He invents a new problem every day. I mean, now it's the left that's the biggest threat to democracy.
I mean, thinking the problems are invented, I don't think is a very convincing line. The problems of crime and disorder in our cities. That's something J.D. Vance is talking about a little bit more specifically than Donald Trump, I think in a more helpful way, that media is trying to ignore and pretend don't exist. That's not helpful. Now, I don't want authoritarian solutions to these problems either. I want these problems properly characterized, because sometimes they are exaggerated, but it's just not helpful, and people tune out when you say, oh, there's nothing wrong, nothing bad is happening.
But Robby, no one's saying nothing's bad. I'm saying he's inventing
Martha
problems.
Raddatz was saying
But I just want to ask you, do you think it was okay that Donald Trump said he would call for the military and National Guard to go after his political enemies? Aren't you afraid of that?
I think it was bad to say that. I don't think they're actually going to do that. I think it's an empty threat. But I'm not a. This is the inequality of the show, and then I'm not actually you are a Kamala Harris supporter. I'm not a Donald Trump supporter. So like I don't have to defend the things he says that I think are dumb because I'm not a supporter of his. I'm not going to vote for him. I think he should not do those things. I also think it's empty rhetoric with zero chance of actually taking place. But
I mean, I wish that were the case. That most of his rhetoric, well, the stuff that's not going to take place are basically his promises to his voters. What does take place is the fear of democracy being dismantled, which all indications have shown that.
Before we move on, let's very quickly touch on the Kamala Harris promise to black men. Some of that stuff I actually like. I support decriminalizing marijuana and all other drugs. I support, again, we've talked about this previously on the show, crypto, making it more available, having crypto regulation that is supportive of this fledgling industry that's not going to cripple it. I think that's great. I don't think financial handouts to specifically black male-owned businesses is good or, in fact, even constitutional. I think it, or legal. It violates
well, they didn't say specifically
disparate racial stuff. But if you want to do outreach to these communities and say, here are things or loans or programs or whatever that's available that maybe you didn't know about, but they're offered to everyone, but they're just doing outreach, I guess that's fine.
I think this was a broader approach, and the media, and part of it is, Barack Obama has been speaking specifically to black men, has been taking it as something that is geared towards black men. I think it actually affects a lot of men that they're trying to win over, not just black men, Latinos, white men. I think this is a pretty smart move, even though I'm very much anti-crypto. But I feel bad for people who have invested in crypto and might lose their money if there's another bust, and it's to protect assets. So I think it was a very smart approach to this issue.
We've got a lot more to get to today. Stay tuned. More Rising right after this. Former President Bill Clinton has resurfaced. Now, he was sent by the Harris campaign to rural Georgia to use his Clintonian wiles to sway voters to the Democratic ticket. Let's look at what the Trump War Room account on X posted.
You had a case in Georgia not very long ago, didn't you? They made an ad about a young woman who'd been killed by an immigrant. Yeah, well, if they'd all been properly vetted, that probably wouldn't have happened. But if they're all properly vetted, and that doesn't happen, and America is not having enough babies to keep our populations up. Okay. So we need immigrants that have been vetted to do work. Right. There wouldn't be a problem. And he couldn't keep people all torn up and upset.
But the Harris campaign responded, saying it had been, quote, deceptively edited. Let's watch the full clip.
And on the immigration thing, she's the only candidate who has actually endorsed a bill that would hold down immigration in any given year to a certain point, and then make sure we gave people a decent place to live. We didn't divide people from their children. And we did total vetting before people got in. Now, Trump killed the bill. The bill was being written by senior Republicans in the Senate, and he killed the bill. Why? You had a case in Georgia not very long ago, didn't you? They made an ad about a young woman who'd been killed by an immigrant. Yeah, well, if they'd all been properly vetted, that probably wouldn't have happened. But if they're all properly vetted, and that doesn't happen, and America is not having enough babies to keep our populations up. Okay. So we need immigrants that have been vetted to do work.
Harris has vowed to revive the immigration bill with stricter guardrails and make it law if elected. A version of the bill came to the floor this year, but failed to pass the GOP majority. Riley was killed in February of this year. Now, the Trump campaign said in a statement, Kamala Harris claimed the border was secure just days after Laquan Riley's illegal immigrant killer, Jose Ibarra, crossed into the nation. Ibarra was caught at the border and then released into the country by Kamala Harris. President Trump will secure the border, and he will stop, catch, and release. So I don't know if Bill Clinton is doing a very good job there as a surrogate for the campaign, the Kamala Harris campaign, making some of the points, maybe inadvertently, that Republicans are making.
Actually, I think that's the brilliance of this, is that, I mean, everyone loves Bill Clinton. I'm not a Clinton policy fan, but he just has a way with people that everybody should study. Right, left, center, doesn't matter.
I mean, he has a sexually aggressive way with people.
Correct. And he has also got this way, especially with working class white voters. Remember, he was called Bubba. And think about that. He had that trucker hat on. Well, I don't know, there's an old rule, you never put a hat on a politician, but it works for him. He's got the trucker hat on. He's speaking in the South. He knows how to speak to people. Not only is he speaking to voters that need to come out and vote, the base, but he knows, because he's media savvy, and he studied Ronald Reagan for years, that clip, whatever it was, even if it was taken out of context, the Republican Party boosted a clip of Bill Clinton saying that immigration issues need to be taken seriously, and then also talking about how we are not producing enough babies in America, which leans in on the IVF issue. So thank you so much, Republican Party, because you took our best messenger, Bill Clinton, of probably the modern political history, and you have boosted his video over and over and over again, inadvertently thinking that you're attacking him when what people are seeing is Bill Clinton talking to them in a persuasive way about the issues that supposedly Republicans are trying to fearmonger on. I thought it was brilliant.
I don't understand the choice to use Bill Clinton at all at this point. I mean, Dems can't have it both ways, especially when they're making the, sexual misconduct argument against Donald Trump, everything that he has allegedly done, bringing that all up all the time. Bill Clinton's history on this is appalling. It's
he didn't rape anybody.
Bill Clinton?
He didn't rape anybody. He was never tried for rape.
Well, okay.
Convicted.
The accusations against him concerning, what is her name? I can't think of her name at the moment. Anita Broderick, yes.
Who?
That one is very, very, very bad. It's a very compelling story. Again, I just...
far right-wing pundit now, and conveniently came out...
Oh, she's a right-wing pundit now? So her very compelling story of it's not just sexual misconduct, of full-on rape can just be discarded? I mean, what are the rules here? Then can't we throw out anything against...
Okay, we're going to have this is a whole different conversation, and I have a lot of criticisms of Bill Clinton.
Dems should just retire Bill Clinton because he is tainted goods because of all of these things that he was accused of.
He was never convicted. Are we going to go back to Ken Starr? Are we going to play this game and pull up the Starr report? I mean, I don't like what happened to him, and I feel horrible for Monica Lewinsky and how it ruined her life for 20 years, and she's come back and she speaks about it. She's also going to vote for Kamala Harris, by the way. She also voted for Hillary Clinton.
Well, Monica Lewinsky it was still bad. It was a workplace. It wasn't. You can argue the consent dynamics or whatever. It's very different than Anita Broderick, which is very, very bad.
I mean, of course there were power dynamics at play. With that being said, in 2016, Hillary Clinton, notably, Robby Mook, her former campaign manager, decided to
Robby.
The evil Robby. Sorry. I'm trying to be serious here. Robby Mook decided to put Bill Clinton to the side. When Bill Clinton said, hey, maybe we should have an office in Wisconsin. And when Bill Clinton said, we really got to focus on those white working class voters in the Rust Belt, Robby Mook was like, nah, we're good. We're good. Thanks, Bill. Go sit aside. He was the best campaigner, and they put him on the sidelines. Now, does he sometimes say the wrong thing like every politician? Does he sometimes need a snack? I really think that whatever vegan diet he's on, and I'm all about plant-based diets, he sometimes get a little cranky? Sure. There were some clips in 2016 where he was snapping at veterans, talking about how they didn't understand foreign policy, and obviously the veterans are like, I lived it. All politicians have their pluses and minuses, but he's still one of the best and most persuasive folks in politics that can speak to those white working class voters, especially if Joe Biden isn't able to do so anymore.
I think he's just utterly repulsive. He looks also very bad and very old. So I Googled what his age is. He's 78. He is the same age as Donald Trump, who might be the next president. I think Donald Trump looks like he's in a lot better, younger shape than Bill Clinton.
Well, if Bill Clinton
is also
wore orange makeup,
considerably younger than the current president, Joe Biden. That man we just saw looks very, very old. is 3 years younger than
Kamala
the person
Harris
running our nation right now.
looks great, put out her medical records. The worst thing she has is like a skin allergy. Donald Trump should put out his medical records.
I'm
He's
fair.
obese and he has had health issues. I think he should do it.
I'm fair and balanced. I have nothing negative to say about Kamala Harris's health or mental situation. I have not questioned it once. I just don't agree with her policies.
That should not be where our basis is.
Because there's widespread denial. There was widespread denial of the cognitive problems of Joe Biden by everyone surrounding him up until he did that debate, and it was no longer possible to pretend that he was fine. Everyone stopped lying about it. Yeah. All right, we've got more to get into today. More Rising coming up next. Oopsie, it appears that Vice President Kamala Harris plagiarized parts of her 2009 criminal justice book. That's according to new reporting from City Journal's Christopher Rufo. Rufo reports that, quote, Kamala Harris plagiarized at least a dozen sections of her criminal justice book. It was titled Smart on Crime, according to a new investigation. The current vice president even lifted material from Wikipedia. Now, Rufo's team found that multiple violations were comparable in severity to the plagiarism found in former Harvard president Claudine Gay's doctoral thesis. CNN also reviewed several of the passages highlighted by Rufo, found that Harris and her co-author failed to properly attribute language to sources. As an example, Rufo points out that in one section of the book, Harris, without proper attribution, quote, reproduced extensive sections from a John Jay College of Criminal Justice press release. She and her co-author passed off the language as their own, copying multiple paragraphs virtually verbatim. As another example, in a section about a New York court program, Harris, quote, stole long passages directly from Wikipedia, which is long considered an unreliable source by some. She not only assumes that online encyclopedia's accuracy, but copies its language nearly verbatim without citing the source. That's from Rufo. For context, Harris co-authored her book, at the beginning of her political career, the run-up to her campaign to serve as California's Attorney General. The book was meant to help establish her credibility on criminal justice issues. We requested the Harris campaign's response, but we did not receive one as of yet.
Unsurprisingly, the story took off on conservative social media. Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, reacted to the story, tweeting, quote, "Hi, I'm J.D. Vance. I wrote my book, unlike Kamala Harris, who copied hers from Wikipedia."
Fox News contributor Joe Concha wrote, quote, "Gotta say this is the least surprising thing I've read in quite some time. Bit ironic that plagiarism is what doomed Biden's first run for president back in 1988. Then again, the media will completely ignore this because of who is breaking the story, and that's just a whole bowl of wrong." Donald Trump Jr. wrote, quote, "Yikes, more evidence that Kamala Harris is a fraud." And I saw that the New York Times actually has covered this controversy, but let's not give them credit too quickly. Here is their headline: Conservative activist seizes on passage from Harris book.
Yeah.
They're seizing on the fact. Look, they found it's real. It is very serious plagiarism in my view. I've looked it over. It is extensive. It is passage after passage. For instance, that John Jay College press release, it's just copy and pasted a long, substantial section. If you do that, you have to put it in quotes and say it's from John Jay College press release. You put it in quotes. This isn't even like an example where, like in some of the Claudine Gay stuff, where it was attributed to another source, but it was not paraphrased enough, and so you should have put it in quotes. This is not even attributed, and it's direct. It's not paraphrased at all. It's direct.
Facts are stubborn things. This is a 200-page book. There is one paragraph in which, by the way, they quoted from the John Jay release all the other citations, and one paragraph didn't have the quotes around it. But guess what? Right next to it, there was a citation. It just didn't have the quotes around it. This was like a clerical error. It was a mistake. Editors need to do a better job at this kind of thing. But this is such a nothing burger of a story, and it just shows how desperate the right wing is right now to win, that they're literally saying, oh, they forgot to use a quote, when 5 other paragraphs from that same thing, which was cited, by the way, in the footnotes next to the paragraph, had quotes around it. This is such a nothing burger.
It's not a nothing burger at all. I'm sorry,
really
that's
don't have any. It was not plagiarism. CNN did a whole fact check on this. Robby, are you serious?
It's absolutely plagiarism. It meets the definition of plagiarism
if the page has 4 paragraphs with quotes around it, citing that it was from this John Jay press release, and one paragraph does not have quotes around it, but it also has a citation of the press release.
It's not one paragraph. It's 12 separate sections that do not have quotations or proper attribution. This is very serious. If this was
Kamala's
a
part?
Republican candidate or pundit,
We wouldn't use it.
CNN.
We wouldn't use it. This is ridiculous.
Absolutely. CNN's K-File, great reporter. He does this all the time, finds examples of plagiarism from Republicans and Democrats. This has ruined Republican pundits' careers. He digs it up. He's reported it. It's well established that that's fair to do. This falls squarely in that category. If there's anything mitigating about it, it's that I don't actually believe she even wrote this book. She probably had some ghostwriter do it. So maybe it's on that person rather than her. I don't know if that makes it better necessarily, that I don't believe she actually wrote her own book. But it is definitely plagiarism. You just got to take the L.
No, they're grasping. They're really grasping.
That's not just my opinion, by the way. Ryan Grimm, progressive, former co-host of this show, he tweeted, good example of the New York Times just not being willing to take an L on Kamala's behalf. This is not a he said, she said. The book has a bunch of plagiarized sections. It just does. You can say that's not a reason not to vote for it, but it is plagiarism. It's not a nothing burger. It's clear academic, writerly misconduct.
John Jay was cited. This was an editorial issue. I mean, I would be very angry if I had found out that the editors didn't properly put things in quotes, but that is not Kamala Harris. She already cited where it came from. It's in the footnotes of
what about the section copy-pasted from Wikipedia?
The footnotes. Go look at the footnotes. This has just been fact-checked by CNN, as you stated.
You can't just put a footnote.
I understand that, and that's the editor's job. That is not Kamala Harris. And why are we even having this conversation 2 weeks before the election when you have a literal guy who wants to incite violence and is calling for the military
the election, will I be allowed
enemies?
to point out Kamala Harris's plagiarism? Where's the date on the calendar where it will be allowed to discuss some flaws of the...
Not quoting something properly, and that's the editor's fault.
At no point did I say that Kamala Harris's plagiarism is akin to inciting violence or is some reason to support Donald Trump. It's just bad in its own right. And this is exactly what's wrong with the Democratic progressive worldview right now. It's just you must be required to overlook all the flaws in the candidate. I mean, I agree with you. It would have been better to visit some of these flaws of Kamala Harris in terms of an actual primary and debate process where voters on the Democratic side are deciding who is the least flawed candidate to be their person, who's the most compelling person. They did not do that. They just coronated Joe Biden and then were forced to concede that he is mentally incapable of being the president again and dramatically and suddenly substituted him for Kamala Harris, who has not been vetted or tested or approved by any voters.
We were here 5 months ago.
Your side is in this situation where you have a deeply flawed candidate who has not been subjected to this bare minimum of scrutiny that would point out she plagiarized the book she wrote.
Robby, she is dealing with scrutiny at all levels. What I am saying is that the Republican Party right now, if this is what they're doing, it means they are trying so hard to damage her that they're taking something that is really a nothing burger. I've worked on campaigns. You've been covering campaigns for years. This is not something, I mean, you were really flailing at this point. If you're starting to look at books and seeing that something wasn't, even though it was cited in the footnotes.
Plagiarism and Biden's first attempt at the presidency.
And he had to get out of the Democratic primary. But we're not talking about 1988 using a speech of a UK politician from the same speechwriter, by the way. We're talking about Kamala Harris 2 weeks before the election versus Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is so desperate that their people are, I mean, the fact that it got this much attention, and Joe Concha, spare me, you're in the media. Joe Concha at Fox News saying, the media reporter saying, the media is not going to pay attention, but I also speak on the largest news network in the world. And as I Google this, there are literally hundreds of articles, and we're talking about it right now. I just love how the GOP is like, no one pays attention. No one pays attention to the criticisms of Kamala Harris. Meanwhile, if you see what progressives are talking about, and Democrats, we're furious at the New York Times based on their coverage of how this election is playing out.
It's utterly, it's the most, furious with the New York Times for not being pro-Kamala enough. It's actually literally insane.
Not understanding
their framing of this, the New York Times, is not Kamala Harris, the possible next president, plagiarized her book. That's not their headline. Their headline is conservative activist seizes on passages. How dare you notice that she engaged in the plagiarism? That's the reporting. That's the news. It's insane. It's deeply, it reflects an unwellness of the soul to be minimizing, to have to pretend these problems don't exist because you're so afraid of Republicans or Donald Trump.
Well, the publisher afterwards has literally admitted that they were at fault. So I looked at even
falling on their
conservative
sword
media.
for her. That's very kind.
Well, the Washington Examiner, conservative news outlet, is even saying that. So maybe it's a nothing burger. Maybe this is going to go away in 24 hours and nobody cares, because nobody cares about a quote. They care about the economy, they care about how their lives are going to be better, and they care about democracy. I don't think they care about a poorly cited book from 20 years ago that the editors didn't cite properly of what? Wonkiness? Nobody cares. Bad move.
Well, you, the viewers, can tell us what you think. I'm sure we'll be covering this additionally on the show later this week. I might have something to say about it in a radar. Stay tuned. More Rising in just a minute. Gender identity is now a top issue in women's sports, according to the Wall Street Journal. The editorial board says the issue of athletes who are born male but identify as female has rocked the sports world and the political sphere. They write, every election has issues that are predictable, abortion, the economy this year, but also some that surprise the political class. This year, one sleeper issue is progressive transgender coercion, which is playing against Democrats in races across the country. The board goes on to explain that, quote, these days, the hard edge of the transgender movement has dictated that its view of gender must be imposed nationwide. Senate Democrats have towed that line. As examples of how important the issue has become, the board cites an ad in Ohio that calls out Senator Sherrod Brown for voting to, quote, let transgender biological men participate in women's sports, and criticizes him for being too liberal for Ohio. Media fact-checkers like PolitiFact, however, argue that Brown did not directly vote for that. Transgender sports is not just an issue in Ohio, it's also bubbling up in Wisconsin, where an ad says the Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin, quote, voted to let biological men into women's sports. Her Republican challenger, Eric Hovda, gets applauded whenever he raises the issue at campaign events, per the Journal. The same is also happening in the Montana Senate race. The piece also points out, last year, 69% of Americans told Gallup that transgender athletes should only be allowed to compete on sports teams that conform with their birth gender. The editorial board blames the media for part of the problem, writing, quote, this media conformity is one reason the transgender sports issue is catching Democrats by surprise. The press portrays any dissent on the issue as out of political bounds and gives it no coverage or dismisses as benighted bias what millions of Americans view as common sense. This means voters may hear about it only when politicians make it a campaign issue, and it might cost Democrats control of Congress this year.
So Republicans have been campaigning on this for a long time. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, as I'm sure you are, when they really brought this up in political context the first time with bathrooms, right? It's over, 10 years ago at this point. I really think that the GOP and the right wing and the Steve Bannons of the world have strategically for years wanted to make this a dividing issue because they knew they were losing some women. And now with these ads, which are airing during NFL games and women's athletic games and these billboards, as you mentioned, these are all in key states where they're losing with conservative women over abortion and democracy, I'll say too. I mean, there are a lot of folks who I think are never Trumpers who don't know whether or not they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, and now the women are starting to move over. They're trying to keep them in on the conservative female voter. This isn't about progressives. This isn't even about Democrats. It's about fear tactics, and they're targeting folks in the final stretch. It's a gamble, but it could work because it might just come down to a few votes.
I mean, it could work because most Americans, set aside, the bathroom thing is a different thing. I probably agree with you that was like a little bit of a fear-monger, public restrooms are not sacred, comfortable spaces, right? Who cares if it's, I think they should be restructured to afford everyone more privacy, like the group, hand washing area and then private for whatever. That's a better way to me. And in general, I'm for just providing additional accommodations for trans people to have their own.
That should be your radar
spaces.
This week. I think this is great. I'm loving what you're saying.
Well,
here.
You're loving me so far, but here's where I'm going to lose you because the sports issue is a little bit different. I do think both at the level of less serious competition in younger people sports and then also elite competition, the advantages under some circumstances that trans women have over other women are serious and should be considered that is a basic kind of unfairness, and that also making accommodations if it's just throwing people who have recently changed their gender identity in the same locker room facilities at like the high school level is going to cause issues. Like, I think it should not be considered transphobic to say that, okay, there are some maybe different accommodations we're going to make there, some basic unfairness that will come into play. That's the view of the vast majority of Americans. It's not been the view of the Democratic-run education departments, but it is an issue.
If you poll Americans, there are all shades of this issue. Just like when you poll Americans on, being pro-choice, there's shades of where people stand on these issues. And I do think that we should have a larger, more healthy conversation around this, because Democrats also need to understand what people are feeling on the ground. Young people are overwhelmingly supportive of the trans community, and the elementary issue, I don't think most young people are concerned about it at schools. But with that being said, we saw this play out over the summer, right? We watched the Olympics and we saw how the right wing spread disinformation, falsehoods about two athletes, and in claiming that they were trans, and of course they were not, and then they faced violence. Trans or not, by the way, when there is a centerpiece, when you make a person who's in the trans community the enemy, there are a lot of people who get really angry at this, and it's because the conservatives have been making this a divisive issue for the last decade and a half. I mean, really forever, but decade and a half. It has become a pillar in the conservative movement, and as a result, you've seen more trans hate crimes rise. In the trans community, at least in New York, there's a housing issue, there's a mental health issue.
Hate crimes against trans people are not increasing. That's
yes,
disinformation.
There are.
No, you want to start throwing. I would not use that term ever, but since you like to use it, that's not. And trans people are subject to violence not because of hate-related reasons, because they're disproportionately more likely to be engaged in work that is criminal and occasionally engages in violence, including prostitution and drug stuff. That is why there is more violence in that community. It's not because they're being hate crime because they're trans. It's just false. It's absolutely false.
I'm saying hate crime due to the rhetoric. That's separate from the work.
That's not happening.
I mean, there is an unhoused situation in New York, and yes, it does often have to do with
unhoused because
sex work. No, it does. You're right.
Transgender overlaps with mental health issues, and drug addiction issues, which lends itself toward homelessness.
But society does not, because we don't have inclusive laws, because there's workplace issues for transgendered people who cannot access normal work, because we have a prejudiced society, partly due, almost solely due, to the fact that we have a right wing which will point fingers at people. I mean, if you're a trans person on Twitter or any social media, the amount of hate you get, which turns into real life violence.
No.
I just disagree with you, Robby. I think you're coming from a privileged position as, no offense, but as there is a different experience for a white man on X than there is for a woman, a person of color. You don't see the incoming hate.
Say something that trans activist community, not transgender people at all, the activists on this issue, say something that they disagree with on social media, you will be flooded with a level of hate and threats like you will never believe.
That's not good.
This has happened to transgender people. This has happened to Brianna Wu, who I've interviewed on this show, who is
I know Brianna.
Is a transgender woman. She's an interesting, thoughtful person. We have some disagreements. We've had a civil debate on this show and on social media about them. She's been subjected to hate by activists on this issue.
But that was not about that. It was about her stance on Israel and how she's progressive. But 2 years ago, transgender violence, hate crimes were at a record high. This is absolutely in correlation with how, number one, the media handles this issue, number two, how conservatives just insert it in every single conversation and make it a divisive issue. Most voters are not voting on this issue. We know what most voters are voting on. And if they're going to try to sway a few conservative women to stay home instead of voting for Donald Trump with these attack ads, that's their strategy. To make them feel like Kamala Harris is not for them. I don't really think it's going to work at the end of the day, but this is all about ginning up the base and the hate, just like they talk about immigrants, just like they talk about crime, just like they talk about the left.
You can criticize their rhetoric all you want. I've criticized some of it too. We should maybe at a later date drill down on the statistics a little bit more deeply. The idea that hate crimes are widely rising is not well founded in data. There are actually very few hate crimes overall. It's a small category of overall crime. Usually people don't commit violence against other people because they hate them or they have some ideological against some aspect of them. They usually commit crime because it's domestic abuse or workplace abuse or mental illness or
That's not classified
crime.
as a hate crime. You can't lump all crime together.
That is what I'm saying is that
and
is
the transgender community is
99%
a
of crime
a
is
small
that.
portion of society. So in that, disproportionately, there's more hate crime, and it's rising for a small
Not
portion
rising. It's
of
not.
America. We'll debate it another day.
All right, more rising coming up. Well, Christopher Columbus used to be considered a hero, especially to Italian Americans like myself. In fact, Columbus Day was conceived as a way to recognize the achievements of Italian Americans. But decades later, thanks to wokeness, Columbus has gotten a bad name.
I prefer to refer to yesterday as Indigenous Peoples Day, and just 20 days away from the 2024 presidential election, people's eyes were on how both candidates spoke about yesterday's significance to American history. Vice President Kamala Harris marked the day on her X account, writing, "This Indigenous Peoples Day, I am thinking about the young Indigenous leaders I met in Arizona last week. I am counting on their leadership and looking forward to our partnership." Here was Harris back in 2021, speaking to the National Congress of American Indians.
It is an honor, of course, to be with you this week as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, as we speak truth about our nation's history. Since 1934, every October, the United States has recognized the voyage of the European explorers who first landed on the shores of the Americas. But that is not the whole story. That has never been the whole story. Those explorers ushered in a wave of devastation for tribal nations, perpetrating violence, stealing land, and spreading disease. We must not shy away from this shameful past, and we must shed light on it and do everything we can to address the impact of the past on Native communities today.
The Trump-Vance campaign wrote on their official website yesterday, "Radical Kamala Harris wants to get rid of Columbus Day. Kamala Harris wants to get rid of this holiday, honoring the hero that discovered a new world." In 2019, Kamala said she'd support renaming Columbus Day, and a review of Harris's X account for her vice presidency shows she has exclusively celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day over Columbus Day each year she has been in office. The Trump campaign National Press Secretary, Carolyn Levitt, told Fox News yesterday, "Kamala Harris is your stereotypical leftist. Not only does she want to raise taxes and defund the police, she also wants to cancel American traditions like Columbus Day." President Trump will make sure that Christopher Columbus's great legacy is honored and protect this holiday from radical leftists who want to erase our nation's history, like Kamala Harris. Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day? I mean, I kind of am dismissive of this whole everybody gets a day sort of philosophy.
What about Robby Day?
Yeah, what about Robby? Every day should be Robby Day, and it is on Rising.
It is in my life, whether I want it or not. I mean, okay, Italians got a lot of people, and I mean, Stanley Tucci. Let's have a Stanley Tucci Day. Not only is he a great-looking guy and so charming, but the man knows how to cook. I just ordered his new cookbook. I'm so excited. So, okay, Italians, you got a lot going for you. Christopher Columbus, I wouldn't be highlighting his history as somebody who brought smallpox, influenza, measles to the Americas, wiped out the Taino population, almost wiped out the Taino population in the Caribbean and northern South America. Of course, the horrible things that Columbus and other Europeans brought to the New World, as they called it. But he also wasn't the first European to come to 5 centuries earlier. Leif Erikson came, the Viking. Why don't we get Viking Day?
I love, now you're preaching my language. I love Leif Erikson. The Vikings they're just cool. There's no way around it. So their contributions are also awesome. Look, I'm certainly for telling all of history and, complicating history. It is true that Christopher Columbus himself, his governance of the island of Hispaniola was very bad. There was a lot of slavery and violence and brutality. Right? We can absolutely tell that full story. Although we should tell the full story on the other side, too. The idea that, the Native Americans were living in ideal, peaceful hippie communes or something, and then the European settlers introduced violence is utterly ridiculous. They were massacring each other all the time. When Cortez went to war with the Aztecs, he had native tribes allying with him because the Aztecs had butchered and murdered and ripped out the hearts of people, like you see in the movie Apocalypto, and it was just really awful. The European subjugation was also awful, but the reality is that history on all sides is messy and complicated and extraordinarily violent by the standards of our, civilized society now. So let's make sure we tell that full, complete story too.
I agree. There are native tribes across North America and South America were at war with each other over land, over other issues, over governance. Some of them had different types of governance. Some of them were matriarchies. Some of them were not. And that's history we should tell, and it's interesting history. But it was still their land. And I think that is the colonizer approach is what's frustrating to most. I don't like Leif Erikson either. I don't like any of these colonizers. They were exploring, but they had a mission. They were, as we know, they had a mission to find spices. They got lost along the way. But then it turned into slave trade. As you mentioned, what he did in Hispaniola with the Taino community, trading the Tainos as slaves. God, Europeans, man, I'm sorry. Just the legacy, and if you study European history and understand what happened, especially in Southern Europe, including in the Roman Empire, slavery is just not a great look. Not a great look across the board, and it is our original sin, whether it was original sins with African Americans, original sin with Native Americans. I'm happy that we're having these conversations.
Yeah, slavery is not unique to the every society has had slavery for millennia, right? And in fact, there was not necessarily a racial connection to slavery until more recently, right? Slavery was often reserved for just defeated and conquered peoples. The Mongol horde crossed all of Asia and killed and enslaved Asians and Europeans. In the Americas themselves, the Aztec Empire, as I just mentioned, was engaged in wars of colonization and enslavement. It is true that then there was innovated this very brutal and awful race-based system of exporting specifically African slaves to the Americas, and that was very, very, very bad, obviously. But it's not, sometimes it's portrayed that only Europe invented slavery or only white Europeans engaged in slavery. No. Every society engaged in warfare and empire building and enslavement, and it was all of human history was pretty bad until very recently, where actually mostly in Northern Europe, the Dutch Republic, British philosophers, Enlightenment came up with a somewhat better system that we've now inherited across the globe.
That was History in 5 minutes with Robby. all I gotta say, it's our original sin. And I think the reason why we highlight European slavery is just because of in America, in the Americas, it changed landscape, it brought brutality, and it ravaged people. And indigenous people deserve a right to have their history told to Americans who are occupying their land on indigenous land. And I think finally we're having that conversation.
The best commentary on Columbus comes from, obviously, one of my absolute favorite television shows, The Sopranos. It's so great. The episode about Christopher Columbus Day, and all these Italian mobster type guys are sitting around complaining that the indigenous rights people are stealing Columbus Day from them, and that they're all complaining about it. And then the one guy who's actually from Italy, Furio, he says, well, but I never like a Columbus. And they go, well, why? And he goes, well, Columbus was a northerner. He spit on us southerners. I hate him. Revealing that, again, even within the country, or whatever country to Italy, but you can say this about any other country, there are, ethnic tensions or regional tensions as well that are sometimes actually increasingly glossed over in our new understanding, where it's like white people is all the same, considered to be the same race. That would have been a surprise to my ancestors.
100%.
Italians, Irish, never considered white until recently.
And it was mainly because there were Southern Italians coming over who, by the way, were considered Greek. So we occupied you, you occupied us.
Indeed. More Rising on the way.
Use your hands, Robby.
Stay tuned for more Rising. Third-party and independent candidates have every right to run for public office, but that's not what Democrats would have you believe. In fact, the DNC is gearing up for a fight, a sign of just how tight this election really is. Now, the DNC released its first ever ad campaign targeting a third-party candidate, Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential nominee. She is portrayed as a spoiler candidate who only benefits former President Donald Trump. Let's watch.
Jill Stein, Green Party candidate for president. So why are Trump's close allies helping her? Stein was key to Trump's 2016 wins in battleground states. She's not sorry she helped Trump win. That's why a vote for Stein is really a vote for Trump.
Jill Stein, I like her very much. You know why? She takes 100% from them.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Meanwhile, there are rumors that Jill Stein is out there solely to siphon off voters who otherwise would vote Democratic. Maybe progressive journalist Mehdi Hasan said it best. Quote, "To all the trolls in my replies today, answer me this. If it is so vital that Harris is defeated in order to stop the genocide, and that there's no difference on Gaza, apparently between Trump and Harris, between the GOP and the Dems, why then do Benjamin Netanyahu and most Israelis want Trump to win and not Harris? Why did Itamar Ben-Gvir say they could do so much better under a Trump presidency? And why should I then ignore the clear desire and public intent of the people literally doing the genocide and listen instead to you?" In fact, the DNC has created a team with seasoned political operatives. And to discuss this further, we have Ramsey Reid, who is a campaign manager, at the DNC for independent and third-party campaigns. Welcome to Rising, Ramsey. I have a lot of questions for you, but let's just start with the lay of the land. How many states do we have third-party factors in terms of battleground states? How many states are we dealing with this issue?
There are candidates, independent and third-party candidates on the ballot in all the battleground states.
Okay, so you solely focus on Jill Stein, but RFK was also a factor, and you guys, the DNC notably fought him in New York, for instance. He's been fighting to stay on the ballot in New York. Why is there a play not just in battleground states, but also in other states? Is it going to affect down ballot races as well?
Well, I think what we've been focused on is holding these candidates accountable to the same rules that we have to play by, and that we think that that's in the best interest of democracy. And the real question to us around ballot access has been why Republicans have been so interested in propping them up and helping them get on the ballot. We've seen Republican consultants helping Jill Stein and Cornel West with ballot access. We have seen Jill Stein hire Trump's former personal lawyer to represent her, Jay Sekulow, a guy notably who's chief counsel at ACLJ that went after protecting the Muslim ban. He defended Trump in impeachment proceedings. So it's a real question to us why Republicans are so focused on propping up these third-party candidates. And it's one of the reasons that we've been so focused on holding them accountable to the same rules that we have to follow.
You point out that Democrats have made a big deal about democracy itself being on the ballot. Don't you think there's a fundamental tension with taking active steps, as the Democratic Party has or its acolytes have in states, to keep other candidates off the ballot? How is that not inconsistent with the idea that democracy itself is at stake? In fact, doesn't play into arguments that some would make that the Democratic Party is itself then a threat to democracy?
Well, we haven't tried to keep anyone off the ballot. What we've tried to do is make sure that they're accountable to the rules. And so when
what about RFK Jr. in New York?
What we saw with RFK Jr. Generally was that he and Donald Trump shared the same largest donor, that they initiated an illegal ballot access scheme where he tried to have Donald Trump's biggest donor put millions into a super PAC to pay for his ballot access, which is an illegal in-kind contribution, and we pointed that out. And what we also saw with RFK Jr. was this repeated pattern of fraud and deception to try and get on the ballot, when in reality he didn't actually have genuine grassroots support. He was just trying to use Donald Trump's top donor to put him on the ballot to try and hurt Kamala Harris.
I mean, as a New Yorker, you make a good point. I mean, you have to get a certain number of signatures with valid voters to get on the ballot. And, this was played out in the press extensively, and the ties are undeniable. with Jill Stein in particular, I mean, what really concerns me as a progressive who sees her pop up every 4 years is just how she represents herself as this environmentalist, but someone who's actually worked in the environmental movement. Pretty much every environmental leader from Bill McKibben onwards, from the greatest environmental leaders, say she has been nowhere in the movement. And yet she pops up every 4 years now with conservative Trump consultants. And you have an issue in some of these battleground states where they're frustrated over very legitimate things. And, and I understand in places like Michigan, the folks who are deciding to just not vote or are deciding to vote third party, want to exercise their frustration over the situation in the Mideast. But can we talk a little bit about her ties with, if you care about the Mideast, we also have to care about Syria. And there's this Assad tie that has been really concerning. And I think it's important to illustrate, if you're going to vote for somebody, we also have to understand who that person is. And I just don't feel like folks who are thinking about voting for Jill Stein really understand who this person is.
Nomiki, I think that's a really good point. I think that Jill Stein claims a moral high ground, but we have seen her repeatedly fail to call Assad a war criminal. She has, failed to denounce his actions. And she's downplayed the role that he had in the Syrian uprising. I think she even questioned its legitimacy. She speculates that deaths of thousands of people in Syria were a false flag operation. But that's sort of this repeated pattern of behavior from Jill Stein. We see it with Vladimir Putin, where she also has dodged and evaded opportunities to call Putin a war criminal. She uses Kremlin talking points, even while, the Russians propped her up in 2016 and while they're actively, attacking American democracy now.
Well, she went to that dinner, that famous dinner. I think there's a lot of folks who have questions about Russia's influence, but it's undeniable that they have some influence in our elections. But she went to that dinner famously at the RT dinner, which is part of Russian state media, in Russia, sitting next to Mike Flynn and Vladimir Putin. That photo, which you can find online, was like, this person had no experience in environmental movement, okay? And she's running as a Green Party person, and people who are in the environmental movement get frustrated with her every 4 years for using their cause to divide the election.
And I'm, this is going to put me in a weird position where I'm going to be defending Jill Stein, even though I'm not. I'm less left than even you two are, and I don't agree with her Syria policy or maybe many other policies. Although as someone who is very concerned about what's going on between Israel and the rest of the Middle East, I am glad that she's a voice for these issues. And I think it's absolutely fair to point out, as she does, that she thinks what's going on is a genocide, and Democrats, Biden is facilitating it, and Harris would facilitate it, and Trump would facilitate it as well. That's, again, her argument, not mine. That's what she's saying. And thus, you shouldn't vote for any of those people. You should vote for her. And I think it's very weird to beat up on third-party candidates who have tremendous institutional, systemic issues to get this ballot access. You're going after them for they don't have real support. It's difficult for them. The Democrats and Republicans are automatically on the ballot. It's a winner-take-all system where the third-party candidates, even if RFK Jr. has 5, 10, or 15% of popular support in polls, he would end up with zero representation of the government because it's a winner-take-all system.
Robby, you can criticize candidates. Sorry to jump in here. You can criticize candidates. This isn't about the ballot access. This is about a candidate and her stances and her history, and people don't know enough about it, which is, why I wanted to talk with this program in the DNC, because, it's the first time I've ever seen folks actively call out her misrepresentations, that other than activists on the side who've been angry for years. So, is this working with those voters? How are you able to sway voters who might be watching right now saying, I don't know if I should vote for Kamala Harris, or I don't know if I should vote third party or stay home? What is your message to them?
Well, I think it starts with 2016, where she campaigned on Trump and Clinton being the same, where she won 132,000 votes in the blue wall states. And that was more than Trump's margin, 77,000 votes total, that Trump's margin was in those 3 states. And then Trump was elected. She helped deliver him to the White House. And then she watched him try to implement the Muslim ban. She watched him appoint Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, who dismantled climate regulation. She watched him preside over horrific public health response, telling people to inject bleach. And then she decided, great, sounds good, badge of honor. Very happy to do it again. And so that's what's so disturbing. And so for us, we know that she has absolutely no path to victory.
But she's not making an argument that you should vote for Donald Trump. She's making an argument you should vote for her.
What she's saying is that Harris and Trump are the same and that you should vote for her. But what you see at her events are surrogates and endorsers who go out there and openly admit that she has no path to victory and that success for them is in stopping Kamala Harris. So when you couple that with the fact that she has no regret over her role in 2016, there's no other way to view this other than a vote for Jill Stein is a vote for Trump. And for us, we want to make sure that voters understand that when they are considering voting for Jill Stein, that they're voting for Trump. And if you want Donald Trump back in the White House, by all means, Jill Stein is a perfectly reasonable vote. But if you don't want Trump, then you can't take a risk voting for Jill Stein.
And how is Donald Trump's policy different than Kamala Harris's policies when it comes to the Mideast? This is incredibly important for folks, as we noted with Mehdi Hassan, who spoke about this. This is incredibly important for folks who are in battleground states that are frustrated with Mideast. But I feel like we don't talk about that enough. How are they different?
Well, I think Jared Kushner just the other day said he wants Netanyahu to finish the job in Gaza. And Kamala Harris has been very clear. She wants an immediate ceasefire. She wants the hostages released, and she wants an end to the suffering in Gaza. And I think that this question gets at something really important with Jill Stein, which is that she attacks Harris and she attacks Democrats relentlessly. She never attacks Donald Trump.
That's just not true. We've interviewed her on this show, and she had very unkind things to say about both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And, you could say that Kamala Harris has spoken out about the suffering of the people in Gaza, but Kamala Harris, unlike Donald Trump right now, is in a position to do something about it because she's a part of the administration. And the administration's policy has been to support and arm and send money to Israel no matter what, despite quibbling or disliking Netanyahu personally or not. The rhetoric, who cares about the rhetoric? The action has been in lockstep support. And again, I'm not even speaking from my own perspective here. I'm just trying to represent why a left-leaning or progressive person might say that Kamala Harris is unacceptable based on her attachment to the administration and what she supported, and thus we're going to vote for someone else. I mean, that's the argument the Green Party is making. This party is not viable. It doesn't matter if it's viable or not. What their policies are inexcusable, and so you should vote for us.
Robby, I think it's pretty unquestionable that Jill Stein only has smoke for Democrats. If you look at her email program, you look at her events, you look at her remarks, she is overwhelmingly attacking Kamala Harris and attacking Democrats. And I think that really tells you what you need to know. When you couple that with the fact that Donald Trump says, I like Jill Stein. She's one of my favorite politicians. She takes 100% from them. When you couple that with the fact that she openly admits and willingly takes Republicans' help with her ballot access, that she hires consultants who are at January 6th on the Capitol, that were at the Capitol on January 6th, when she says that she would consider pardoning people who were at the Capitol on January 6th, pardoning Trump. She pushes MAGA talking points. She downplays a lot of the things that, are really at risk in this election. She was asked about Project 2025 and downplayed it as propaganda. And so I think it's pretty obvious that Jill Stein is in the race as a spoiler to help Trump. And that's what we want voters to know.
And not to mention that her history of being anywhere in progressive politics is non-existent, which is something, I'm very concerned about Jill Stein's Mideast policy because I don't know what it actually is. She might say things, but there is no plan, there's no record, there's no history, there's no complexity. And the record that we do have is that she has been dismissive of the war in Syria, questioning the chemical attacks in Syria. And I'm very concerned, and I think we have to think deeply about this. If you're going to vote for someone, know who it is. And, I know where I'm voting, but for folks who are on the fence about voting for Kamala Harris for her positions, are you willing to jump in and vote for somebody who you don't know their real positions or history? I don't know. I mean, do you see this working? Is it working so far? We're going to wrap right now, but just want to, how is the vibe on the ground? Is it actually working?
I think we're not going to take anything for granted. We know what happened in 2016, and we are absolutely going to make sure that voters understand what the risks are, how close the election is, and that their vote counts.
All right. Well, it could come down to a few votes, and it's important to know who you're running against, and everybody has a right to run, but also everybody who's a candidate has a right to be challenged and have their legacy and history called out. So thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the heat.
Thanks, Nomiki. Thanks, Robby.
Ana Kasparian was once a darling of the political left. She's a commentator and co-host of the very liberal Young Turks, but she's gone through a transformation of sorts, frequently feuding with other progressives, particularly on the issue of crime. Now, in a recent interview, she explained what led to her break with her former allies. Here she is on the Jillian Michaels podcast, Keeping It Real. Let's watch.
Living in LA, I mean, there's homeless people everywhere, right? So I've never had problems. I didn't think anything of it. But as I was bending down to pick up my dog's mess, one of the guys grabs me by my hips, and he had an erection.
Oh, God.
And just starts humping me. And I didn't know what to do. I opened up about this on the show, not really thinking much of it. And before I knew it, I'm starting to get these messages, and it's really, really harsh stuff. And it's about how you are painting a picture of the homeless community. You know, how could you be like this? You know, these are your unhoused neighbors and they need help. A few people accused me of being racist when I had never disclosed the race of the individuals who did this to me. And in fact, they were white.
They eat their own, Mama.
Some of the people.
They eat their own on the extreme left.
Ana's co-host, Cenk Uygur, and founder of TYT, defended Kasparian, posting on X, quote, "For extreme leftists, or whoever you are and whatever you'd like to call yourself, who would like me to fire Ana Kasparian for being open-minded instead of agreeing with you 100% of the time, as you demand, here's my answer, no, F off." The Daily Mail reacted, posting, quote, "Glamorous journalist reveals she ditched Dems after they sympathized with homeless pervert who molested her." Okay, so I used to work for TYT. As you know, I know both of these people very well, and I'm friends with them. So I just want to disclose that up front. With that being said, I appreciate how Cenk is very loyal to people. He's been loyal to me in tough moments, and he justifies that loyalty as being friends with someone and being open-minded and having lots of different voices on his show and openly disagreeing with them, as he does on the show with Ana regularly. I'm a little perplexed at Ana's sudden shift, because it's, in this moment to announce that you're leaving the Democratic Party 2 weeks before the election, I get that we need to have spaces for conversations about difficult issues that sometimes progressives either don't want to recognize or realize are bigger issues in the movement. I mean, I think Democrats do need to talk about how people are feeling in terms of the unhoused communities and not having housing and crime going up in some cities at some points, and recognizing that that's what people are talking about, or immigration. But just to ignore them is what creates this kind of tension. And so when she was bringing up her experiences, which are valid and real, specifically about her being attacked, this comes after months and months of months in which she has been talking about these issues and then has been attacked online because we live in this polarized world. And I worry that the business model of the internet, sorry to go all internet on you here, but I worry that the business model of the internet has made it so difficult to have conversations so that it's actually pushing people into radicalization. It's pushing people to the extreme. Progressives, we should really be figuring out ways to open up our tent. Just a couple of years ago, she was a co-host on Jacobin, which is a far-left magazine that's Marxist. She was co-hosting their Marxist show with Michael Brooks, who's passed away, the former host, and was on the Majority Board. And I just find it baffling that she would be willing to surrender all of her other political beliefs, which are really about supporting the most vulnerable people in the community, over disagreeing with folks on the left. And I hope she can take time to reassess this, because I don't think this is good for the movement. I don't think this is good for vulnerable communities. I think she can have her position on issues, but just to abandon all of her other principles because, people in her comments section were disagreeing with her, go touch some grass. I love you, Ana, but just take a pause.
Well, I don't know, because I don't consume every single thing she says, but I think she would contend that she has not abandoned her principles or changed everything she thinks. She has maybe adjusted her perspective on this one issue, crime. She thinks, based on what happened to her and the reaction she got from progressives, that they were dismissive, that they didn't want her to talk about this because it was like playing into stereotypes about minorities or the mentally ill or something, and they wanted her to not share her story. Forget about lived experience, which left progressive people, woke people were always going on about, telling your truth, that kind of stuff. That all goes out the window when what you have to say is perhaps could be viewed as not favorable. And she wasn't making broad characterizations of these communities based on it. She's just saying, this happened to me, it really sucked, and I didn't like how people treated me after I said this was awful, and maybe that should be a wake-up call. As you kind of conceded, that should be a wake-up call for progressives and the left, to take these issues more seriously. But I don't think she's actually changed or disaffiliated, her views on her other left-leaning views. She just thinks that there needs to be more done, as do I as a libertarian. I don't think I've changed my views. I don't suddenly want like some police state takeover of America or knocking down people's doors or arresting everybody for just being in the street or something. But I have to contend, having lived in a city now in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, some of the problems have gotten a lot worse in terms of mentally ill people on the streets and occasionally engaged in violence. And something ought to be done about it, or you just ruin all the if we're going to have common public spaces, I guess maybe in my libertarian utopia, I would just say all the common public spaces should be privatized and privately owned, and then the people in charge of those spaces can decide what the rules are and can eject people for trespassing on them, and that would be solve the tragedy of the commons issue. But if we're going to have commons, you have to have enforcement of the rules in the commons. You and I argued about this yesterday, or else you just end up with trash and disgusting graffiti everywhere.
I think my concern here is that as a Marxist, which a couple years ago she was, you would be looking at the systemic issues, and I feel, and I understand she gets so much hate online for a lot of reasons, and there's so much right-wing hate that's been pushed against her. But to say 2 weeks before the election that you're leaving the Democratic Party as a notable voice and going on other podcasts that are not in alignment with your politics and talking about this, which she didn't previously do. And she has in the past called out Dave Rubin, who used to work for TYT, who used to be on the left and then decided to slowly roll into the right. I don't think that's what's going to happen to Anna. I really hope not. I hope she hasn't abandoned everything else. But we can have these conversations. We can recognize that people are concerned about these issues and think, well, how do we as leftists solve these issues? Instead, she started to complain about several issues, not just the unhoused in Los Angeles, but also trans people. And she has a right to complain about issues and discuss them. But it suddenly became, it's the left coming after me for having an opinion, which they were. And now I'm leaving the Democratic Party. But as a Marxist, if you really do care about the most vulnerable people in society, you suck up that tension and you think, okay, I'm going to talk about the systemic issues and I'm going to push the Democrats to go in a different direction, or I'm going to push our greater coalition to understand this more, or we can debate it. I think she is, the business model of the show is YouTube, right? We're on YouTube. It is a really polarizing place. Then she goes on Twitter and she gets attacked and she's in Reddit comments and she's out in the world getting attacked personally by folks for her political views. I understand where this pain is coming from. I just think I hope she can redirect it and reassess it, especially in this really important moment of the election, because she built her career at TYT successfully in advocating for smart systemic solutions to problems in society through a leftist lens. And I really don't want her to throw that entire career out and the network and what she stands for by making a quick decision of leaving the Democratic Party because she was bullied online.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this. MSNBC's Joy Reid can't believe that Americans would ever support Trump, so much so that she's saying Republicans are gaming the polls. Let's watch.
Have you noticed how sharply the polls have shifted in Trump's favor over the last couple weeks? With these claims that Trump is surging with Black and Latino voters and leading in every single swing state, according to secret internal polls, despite all the Hitler talk. Yes, this race will be far too close. Because unfortunately, we do have a fascist groundswell in parts of this country, mainly among white men, let's be clear, but in small pockets among Black and brown men, too. This happens to be a global phenomenon as women become more economically independent and seek positions of power. But friend of the show, Simon Rosenberg, points out that just like in 2020 and 2022, dozens of right-wing polls have been dumped into the marketplace in the last few weeks, 12 in Pennsylvania alone. Those polls then swing the polling averages to the right, making Trump look strong and Kamala Harris look stalled. Now, there are lots of explanations for why you'd want to game the polls. Entrepreneurial Republican pollsters can certainly gain favor with Trump, who's apparently fuming about Vice President Harris's billion-dollar fundraising and positive press. And then there's the more sinister explanation that if Trump, Republican pollsters, and even jittery Democrats convince enough people that his victory is inevitable, how much easier would it be to claim that the election was stolen if he loses? And how much easier would it be to get his base to rise up and maybe even get violent the way they did when he lost the last time?
Reid didn't stop there. She also said that Trump and Republicans are warping Americans' minds with their massive disinformation campaign. Let's watch.
Trump and Republicans, backed by far right-wing billionaires like Elon Musk, and right-wing media and anti-woman manosphere podcasts are creating social media or gaming social media apps like X Twitter in Trump's favor and pumping disinformation into the brains of Trump supporters. Not quite foreign interference, but not exactly different from what Vladimir Putin would do.
And if all of that wasn't enough, the host went on to say this. Let's watch.
Donald Trump is not running a normal election. He's talking America into damn near a civil war to terrify voters into supporting him. And if that doesn't work, he's laying the groundwork for insurrection 2.0.
So I have news for Joy Reid and anyone else in her thought camp here. The polls are not being gamed by Donald Trump. The polls, they might be inaccurate. We'll find out on election day. Last time, in the 2020 election, the polls, there was a massive polling error in Joe Biden's favor because he ended up winning by a lot less than the polls suggested. I don't know if that's what's happening now. It's possible the polls could be benefiting Donald Trump in some way. It's totally possible. Their polling errors do go both ways, although more of them have seemed to benefit Democrats in recent election cycles. That's not universally true. It's different in some races. But this is some copium for, I don't know, progressives of Joy Reid's bent that it's okay. We're winning massively. Donald Trump is such a fascist. Everyone hates him. No one will vote for him. The polls are lying. That is, to use a word you are fond of, I think that is disinformation.
So polls are interesting, as you know. The polling averages, and this is, I think, what she's alluding to, and probably could have explained it a little bit more specifically. Polling averages are a bunch of different polls that come out, say, over a 2-week period. And those polls can be center polls, more accurate polls to Republican or conservative polls, and Democratic polls, and official polls of the Harris campaign or the Trump campaign internal polls. And they average that all in one summary. And it is true. I'm looking at 538.com right now, and the last 6 polls that have come out, 5 polls that have come out in the last couple of days, from October 12th to 14th, are conservative polls. Patriot polling, Acti polling, Patriot polling did another one. So that does affect the average. I don't know if their strategy is correct. I don't know if there's this vast, there might be a conspiracy behind it or a strategy from the Trump campaign. I don't want people to think that Kamala Harris is winning. I think that they should be running scared and that every single person should be thinking about what could potentially happen if Donald Trump were elected. I do think it's fair for her to mention that Donald Trump will question the election, and if the polls are saying, and the conservative poll average, which is really the last week, is saying that he's likely to win, yeah, absolutely he's going to challenge it, because that's what he's done. It's like you judge history by someone's behavior in the past. Of course, social media, you have Elon Musk who owns X that has been devalued 80% and has a mass exodus, and now basically who's left is like right-wing incels and, journalists who just love to get the attention, media people. I'm on there too, I know. I've been called out for it. But I'm not as active as I used to be, and a lot of folks aren't as active. So yeah, there's disinformation spreading on Twitter, without a doubt. FEMA, the FEMA immigrant crisis, that was a classic example. It's been fact-checked. It's really hard to push through fact checks.
Am I allowed to say that FEMA was maybe not doing a great job at all times or getting enough resources to people? Is that misinformation?
We talked about this, though. They had a staffing crisis, and part of that is because their funding was cut, and they just didn't have enough staffing, and staff were overworked, and they were going through multiple natural disasters, and the turnover rate was pretty high. And so they have positions that are empty, and now folks are doing the job of like 6 people.
All right. Well, I'm glad some criticism of them is still permissible. But I want to get back to the polling part of this. I mean, yes, there are polls that are more favorable to conservatives and to the GOP, or that, maybe the polling firm is that way too. But if you started excluding those, and you didn't also exclude the ones that are more favorable on the other side, then you would end up with a skewed poll on behalf of Kamala Harris. Like, that's exactly the problem that Nate Silver, for instance, is trying to prevent when he says that's why he likes to take. I mean, he does, I think, exclude some polls that he thinks are not, that are way outside the bounds or are not well done. But he says you want to take an average because, you want some firms that have been more favorable in terms of the results for Republicans, as well as the ones for Democrats, and that's why you do the average, and that's what ends up being the most accurate. If you start saying, well, we think this poll is not good because its result is too far outside what we expect, because we're expecting like a Kamala +1, and this has, Trump +3 or something, we're taking that out, that ends up skewing the average more in favor of the Democrats, and then the pollsters wake up surprised, or the pundits who were following that wake up surprised on Election Day when it's actually much closer. I mean, that's almost exactly what happened last time.
Well, what happened last time, there are a lot of factors that happened last time. What I was mentioning to you is just this last week, the only polls that came out were conservative polls. Yeah. Yes, 2 weeks ago, Kamala Harris had a poll come out the same week as Morning Consult. But if you're going to average for 1 week and it's all conservative polls that were released that week, that's concerning. I do think Nate Silver is being smarter. Last time we had a different situation in which we had millions and hundreds of millions of new voters voting that don't usually vote because of the pandemic, because of mail-in voting, because of a surge in new registration. And so it was very hard to pull that because it was just a completely unique year. 2016, of course, polls said that Hillary Clinton was going to win, so much so that they were not running scared. They didn't even have an office in Wisconsin. They didn't put voter outreach operations in Pennsylvania the way that they should have in previous years. And obviously we saw what happened, even though she won the popular vote.
But that was self-delusion, right? I mean, if you actually look at the polls in 2016, by the end, what they showed was an extremely close race. They showed Hillary Clinton very barely ahead, or even tied exactly with Donald Trump. But the Hillary Clinton campaign was so sure of themselves, the pundits were so sure that Donald Trump could never win, they were actually ignoring the polls or just saying, it always looks close right before the election. So it wasn't really a poll. In 2016, it wasn't really a polling error. It was a pundit error. It was a misinterpretation of the polls. Whereas in 2020, there was a genuine polling error, but the polls were so favorable to Biden, he still did end up winning, just by a lot less. So it's interesting, or what we think of what was 2020 was the polls are wrong. 2016 was the take-havers, the people like you and I, not specifically you and I, people in our field who were wrong.
Yeah, and they didn't go out. They didn't go out into the field. They didn't talk to voters. Yeah. It was like Beltway syndrome, where have you talked to a working person? Do you understand what's happening in these communities? Do you understand how NAFTA works? People would roll their eyes. I mean, trust me, I was in the Bernie campaign. We were screaming about these issues because we were in a lot of those communities doing well in the primaries and saw folks who were still frustrated with the Democratic Party. And and the Clinton campaign didn't listen to us. But we hopefully have learned our lesson as a collective, and that's probably why Kamala Harris is running scared. With that being said, hopefully the press has learned their lesson as well. And I don't know if they have. And, it's hard to deprogram Beltway syndrome, right?
Yeah.
It's like put a bunch of Ivy League people together, give them all the power in the world to talk about elections and working people, and you can't deprogram that overnight.
I hear that. Well, that does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. And be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts. See you later.